Well, Shaun, thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be on your show here. A couple of years before I started work on the Epstein book, I had, in fact, done a book on Donald Trump and his issues with women. That book was called All the President's Men, Donald Trump and the Making of a Predator. And I decided to do that book initially when he came into office for the very first time, when we were learning all the details about Stormy Daniels and a Playboy model named Karen McDougal. And he was apparently juggling these two affairs from his wife, Melania. And I thought, well, on top of that, of course, right before the election, we had the Access Hollywood tape came out in which Donald Trump said it was okay to grope women if you were a celebrity. And we had 26 different accusations by women against him of sexual misconduct and harassment. And I thought, as a journalist, I said, this is unbelievable. We have a, new president who has this history, and we're learning more about this every day. And so I embarked on a book, an investigative book, and learned that there were even more women than the initial 26 who had come forward. In fact, I think we ended up with possibly 60 allegations against him of sexual misconduct with women. And so it was an eye-opening book to report and to write. And then, of course, Jeffrey Epstein died behind bars during Trump's term in office. And I thought, having done the research into Trump, their worlds were very similar. In fact, they were neighbors in Palm Beach, Florida. They were friends in New York from the late 1980s through the 1990s. I thought that it was worthwhile digging into Jeffrey Epstein because I already had made a lot of sources through my reporting on Donald Trump. So that's how we ended up with Epstein. And I have covered true crime for decades, going back to when I was a college journalist. There was a famous American serial killer known by David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, in New York City, in which he terrorized young couples, shot and killed several teenagers in New York in the 70s. And I, in fact, covered that story from my college newspaper in Philadelphia. And so I've been into true crime, for decades. I covered the O.J. Simpson case. I covered a lot of famous cases here in America: the Susan Smith case, the Natalie Holloway case. It's just been one after another. And Epstein is kind of the ultimate true crime case because it involves so many layers of Americana in terms of his connection to royalty and to presidents and to heads of financial wizards and banks. And the layers of this story, where I titled the book the Spider, because of the web, the tentacles of this particular case go deep and deep and deep. And even a few years now since the book has been published, we're still learning every single day new details. And in fact, I know a great deal of people who I talk to. I've been on numerous shows over this summer. There's such frustration that the Epstein files have not been released and that the government is holding that back. But what this has done is it has brought new awareness to this particular case and story. And I was in Washington, D.C. a few days ago with the Epstein survivors, the victims, who held a press conference on the steps of the Capitol building, and they are united. This promise to America to reveal these files, and then the fact that the government backtracked on that promise and withdrew their promise and basically said there's nothing to see here. We've gone through the material. There's no client list. There's no blackmailing. There's nothing nefarious about his death behind bars. There's no need to release the files, and that's absolutely wrong. And so we have the victims now who are banding together. They're putting together their own list of men that they believe should be investigated. And I spoke with Representative Tom Massey, who was one of the organizers of this rally. And I asked him after the rally, or asked him after the press conference, I said, these women have said today that they plan, if the government isn't going to release the names of these men, possible third parties who need to be investigated, and they're willing to draw up the list themselves. Do you support that? And he said, not only do I support it, but he said, I will read the names on the, in the House chambers. He said, that's how I feel about it. So even though the Trump administration and the Department of Justice continues to hold back the files, we do have some lawmakers in the nation's capital in Washington who are willing to support these women and to take things to the next step. And that's where we need to go, because there are men out there, not only in America, but all over the world, who took part in Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's sex trafficking ring. And then there's other men, not men who participated in the sex trafficking in terms of the sexual abuse, but there are other men who acted as enablers. Now, these were men who put young girls on planes, some people connected to modeling agencies and so forth, that Jeffrey Epstein had connections to. And he had these young girls flown to him in the Virgin Islands to be taken to his island to be abused. And we know for a fact that these men have been paid money to corral these young women. And how they would do this, that they would promise these young women from these Eastern European countries that they could go to America and they could become models. And so they targeted these young girls, put them on planes, and then Jeffrey Epstein would have these girls picked up at the airport in the Virgin Islands at St. Thomas, and he would then transport them by boat to his island for sexual abuse. And we know from after Jeffrey Epstein's death, 2019, that the Attorney General in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a woman named Denise George, this little Attorney General in this far-off island, took on this case and investigated this case. And she found out that there were, from airport personnel who saw these girls being put onto boats to be taken to Epstein's island, that would get off these planes, that some of these girls were as young as 12 years old, which is horrific and sickening. And before they came off the planes, they would be wearing ill-fitting college, university sweatshirts to disguise them, in the sense of trying to make them look older, trying to make them look like they were in college. But in fact, these were children that he was bringing to his island for sexual abuse. So there are men who took part in the actual sexual abuse that he turned these girls over to. And then there are other men who are just as evil, who should be investigated and prosecuted. And these are the men who basically were feeding these girls to the wolf. And they need to be apprehended and they need to be questioned. And the there's a senator here in the U.S., Ron Wyden, from the state of Oregon, and he has been going down the financial road of the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. And he learned that there have been 4,700 wire transfers that totaled $1 billion in money that went through US and Russian banks. And this was money that Jeffrey Epstein used to pay and finance his sex trafficking ring. And when you have bank statements, when you have wire transfers, there's a trail, there's a money trail. Follow the money. The famous saying came out of the Watergate investigation. There are bank records, financial records. Why is our government only waiting now to begin looking into this? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, it really has exposed the rot, and we commend you for going and standing with the survivors when they did their conference the other day, which we were all watching and supporting. And, on this journey, Barry, as you've unearthed this web, the spider's web, did you set out knowing the vast size and scope of the apparatus? Or was that the more you unearthed, the more did you learn?
Well, there's no question, Shaun, that I had no idea how deep this went. And of course, we now know that it's extremely likely that Jeffrey Epstein had connections to intelligence in terms of being a possible intelligence asset, possibly for more than one country. We know that at the time of his slap on the wrist non-prosecution agreement in 2008, in which the FBI at that time, following the initial investigation by Palm Beach, Florida police, and this started back in 2004 with the fact that the Palm Beach police found that Jeffrey Epstein had sexually abused 40 girls in Palm Beach, Florida, some of them going from a particular high school, Royal Palm Beach High, that these girls were groomed in cases by his co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, with a promise of making $200 to give a billionaire a massage, and then they would be asked to bring their friends, and then their friends would be asked to bring their friends. And Jeffrey Epstein on some days was having sexual relations. I won't say sexual relations because that's the wrong word to use. That's the wrong terminology to use. These were rapes. This was forced sexual abuse of minors. And this was happening from 3 to 10 times a day, if you can imagine that. And the Palm Beach police did the absolute right thing when they were tipped off to what was going on behind the walls of his mansion. And in fact, the police chief saw that Jeffrey Epstein had connections in the Palm Beach social community. And the police were afraid that he was going to get away with this. And they brought in the FBI. They brought in the FBI, who began investigating not only what was going on in Florida, but also what had been going on at Jeffrey Epstein's mansion in New York City. And they, through the work of Marie Villafana, they wanted to charge Jeffrey Epstein with 60 counts, which would have put him away for a minimum of 18 years behind bars. And what happened was Jeffrey Epstein lawyered up with a dream team of wealthy attorneys, similar to what O.J. Simpson did in California. And Jeffrey Epstein put together his own dream team. Prominent attorney, Harvard graduate Alan Dershowitz was on the team. Ken Starr, who was a leading attorney in Washington, D.C., was on the team. Jay Lefkowitz, prominent attorney, was on the team. They put together a team of 5 or 6 prominent lawyers. And these lawyers went after the victims. It was victim shaming. They said, they labeled these young girls, these children, prostitutes, which is unbelievable and absolutely revolting. And the Florida attorney connected with the Southern District of Florida at that time, Alexander Acosta, I'm sure your viewers and listeners have heard his name. He ended up striking a deal with Jeffrey Epstein's legal team. And instead of those 60 counts being filed against him, they ended up with not federal charges, but 2 state charges of solicitation of prostitution, one of them being with a minor. And Jeffrey Epstein was given a slap on the wrist conviction of less than a year behind bars. The sentence ended up being 13 months or so. Most of that time, he was out on work release, quote unquote work release, back at his office or his mansion. He had an electronic ankle monitoring device on his leg, and he was still having sex with young girls at the time while he had the electronic monitoring bracelet on his leg. He was still carrying out sexual abuse of minors. The story is horrific. And Alexander Acosta had allegedly said that part of the reason for this plea deal was that Jeffrey Epstein was part of intelligence. He used that word, intelligence, and that Jeffrey Epstein was over his head. To this day, we still don't know who in government may have spoken to Alexander Acosta to tell him to go light on Jeffrey Epstein. We still don't know to this day who exactly Jeffrey Epstein had intelligence connections with. We know that he had a great deal of connections with the Israelis. There's belief that he might have been an intelligence asset for the Mossad, which is the spying agency like America's CIA in Israel. We know that Jeffrey Epstein, despite the government saying that they found no blackmail in the files, we know for a fact that Jeffrey Epstein was into blackmail. In fact, recently, Bill Gates said that Jeffrey Epstein tried to blackmail him, not over sexual abuse with any of Jeffrey Epstein's girls, but a separate, unrelated situation with an adult woman, apparently, that Jeffrey Epstein had learned about. Now, Bill Gates has never been investigated for any connection in terms of Jeffrey Epstein and his women. But it shows you that Jeffrey Epstein was always thinking about blackmail. And he had no issue with blackmailing the most wealthy, highly connected people in the world. And we know for a fact that Jeffrey Epstein associated with foreign dignitaries, former prime ministers, Prince Andrew of the royal family in England, former President Bill Clinton. In fact, Jeffrey Epstein knew him when he was in the White House. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell visited the White House dozens of times. And of course, at that time, he had a long 15-year personal friendship with Donald Trump, who would go on to be President of the United States. So Jeffrey Epstein was given a pass for a long, long time. And we have to wonder exactly when he was finally put behind bars in 2019 and charged by the government, finally, after all those years. And that took the great reporting from the Miami Herald newspaper, who looked into the whole Alexandra Acosta scandal and then reported the story out and reminded Americans in the post-Me Too era of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. And finally, with that outcry, the government finally decided to reopen their investigation of him, and they finally charged him. But then, of course, strange things happened only weeks later behind bars. And we can get into that in terms of, did Jeffrey Epstein take his life, or was his life taken from him?
All right, we've got 1,000 people watching live presently with Barry Levine. How do I pronounce your surnames, Barry? Is it Levine?
It's Levine. Levine is fine.
Levine, with Barry Levine. And The Spider is the name of his book, Inside the Tangled Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. All of the links for Barry's book are in the description box below this video if you're watching it on YouTube. Also, huge thank you for all the tons of questions coming in. We will get to them. Who was the judge that signed off on the Acosta plea deal in Florida 2008? Do we know the name?
Well, the plea deal was overseen by the Southern District of Florida, and they were able to supersede the local Florida laws, and that was put through. And it was put through literally in the middle of the night, in the sense, Shaun, that the feds violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by not informing the victims that they were doing this plea deal with Jeffrey Epstein. They were not informed. They didn't find out about it until afterwards, until it was in the media. So the government worked around the victims to do their own deal because they knew there would be outrage over this. And later, Acosta and the team were put through oversight, and it was determined that there was poor judgment in the terms of the outcome of the investigation. It was yet another slap on the wrist. And this is a man who, had he gone away, had they been able to put him away, had the FBI been able to put him away back in Florida in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein would not have been able to continue abusing minors from 2008 to 2019. And you think of the countless victims that were abused over those years. And as I said earlier in your interview, after the Florida non-prosecution agreement, the plea deal, and the slap on the wrist conviction that he received, he was spending more time at his island in the Virgin Islands, out of the sight of the Florida police, although he still maintained his home there, and also out of the sight of the NYPD in New York, while he still maintained his townhouse there. But he was relying in those final 10 years on fixers overseas to bring girls in from several Eastern European countries. And once he had them on his island, he could do anything he wanted with them. We know the story of one young victim who was so terrified and traumatized over the abuse that took place over there that she actually tried to jump in the water and swim off the island to safety. And of course, with the currents and all that, she couldn't, of course, swim away. She was brought back to the island. And in the research that I did, and the accounts are in the book, and I wrestled a great deal with putting in the detail that I put in from interviews, from court files, from police reports, because so much of it is so damning and so horrific. But to understand what he did and what his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, did in terms of the recruitment and the grooming of these young girls, I had to include that in the book, because unless you know those circumstances, you don't understand the level of depravity from these monsters that took place.
I think that was an important point that was raised at the survivors press conference, whereby it was said that if Acosta hadn't authorized that sweetheart deal, some of those survivors wouldn't have been stood there on that day and wouldn't have had to go through the horrors that they went through. So isn't there a means to subpoena Acosta and find out who the hell told him to give Jeffrey a pass?
Well, he is on the subpoena list. And in fact, Comer's investigation, which is moving along with some subpoenas, and some of them are politically motivated. Let's be realistic here. Hillary Clinton, for instance, why is she on the list? She's on the list for embarrassment. Okay, she was not an associate of Jeffrey Epstein, but Alexander Acosta was not on the list, but he was put on the list. So that interview is going to take place. We're also going to get, which really hasn't been done, we're going to get some answers finally from the Jeffrey Epstein estate. In fact, they are going to have to produce documents next week related to their own files that they've maintained. And also, you've heard in the news about this birthday book that Donald Trump took exception to, claiming that he did not write a letter or draw a picture for Jeffrey Epstein's birthday book. Well, the actual book, from what we believe, is in the hands of Jeffrey Epstein's estate, and that book is going to have to be turned over to investigators next week. So we'll see if, in fact, while Donald Trump has denied the fact that he took part in that, we may actually get to see the book next week and determine if he's telling the truth or not.
So you had a question that came in from a viewer earlier about the dream team of lawyers. How did Jeffrey afford that? And, there's been so much speculation as to where his money came from. We've looked at the property transfer from Wexner. We've looked at the financial services for Black, etc. What are your theories as to where his money come from for him to be able to afford this dream team of lawyers?
Oh, there's no question that he had the money to afford this dream team of lawyers. I mean, his estate at the time of his death was worth $600 million. Okay. Now, that was, of course, before the estate was forced to come up with a victims' compensation fund. And a lot of that had to do with the great work, as I said, of that attorney general down in the Virgin Islands, Denise George, who really wanted to hold his estate accountable, and forced the two co-executors of his estate, his longtime lawyer and his longtime accountant, to pay more than about $100 million to the Virgin Islands, because she had determined that his company that he had based there, a company called Southern Trust, was nothing more than a criminal enterprise in which money was being funneled through them. So she did go after that estate, and rightfully so. And she also forced the estate to come up with a compensation fund for the victims. But Jeffrey Epstein had the money for those lawyers. He was a guy who was a college dropout, but he was a brilliant man in terms of mathematics and finances. He was always able to come up with ways to, I don't want to say cheat the government, but he was able to come up with formulas for very wealthy individuals to maintain their assets, to pay little taxes, and also to enhance their money. And a lot of wealthy men took Jeffrey Epstein on, even though he had been a college dropout. They hired him to work with their finances. And that, of course, is known about. And Jeffrey Epstein only sought out billionaires. He didn't want to work with anybody who had less than $1 billion. He only wanted to work with the super wealthy, because obviously his fees were exorbitant. And he worked with Les Wexner, who the public may know as the founder of the L Brands, Victoria's Secret, and other. He was called the Merlin of the Mall back in the day in terms of clothing stores and so forth. Very wealthy individual, originally from New York, but settled in Ohio. And Jeffrey Epstein became not only his financial wizard, but he also, Jeffrey Epstein, he turned over power of attorney to Jeffrey Epstein. There's still individuals today who question why Jeffrey Epstein was given so much power with this particular individual. And it should be pointed out that this individual, Les Wexner, has never been accused or investigated for wrongdoing in connection with Epstein in terms of any involvement with any of Jeffrey Epstein's victims. But you have to wonder, to me, what type of curse, in a way, control that Jeffrey Epstein would take over some of these people who themselves were smart and brilliant and worked themselves up to have the wealth that they had. What was it about this individual, this college dropout from Brooklyn, New York, that was able to sway these billionaires into working with him? Another man, of course, Leon Black, a major New York financier. He apparently paid Jeffrey Epstein upwards of $158, $160 million for financial work. These were deep-pocketed individuals that Jeffrey Epstein had as clients, and he made a great deal of money from these individuals and ballooned his wealth. But what Jeffrey Epstein did was he knew a lot of important individuals, and he would connect these individuals in doing business deals and things like that. Jeffrey Epstein was a collector of people, and he would have able to tie in a Clinton and a Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, in a business deal with a Wexner or a Black, in the sense that he was putting people together and doing things to help individuals make financial connections and business connections and social connections and so forth. But early on, Jeffrey Epstein was one of his first jobs was as a teacher at a New York private school, teaching math. And he happened to teach the child of the head of Ace Greenberg, who was the head of the Wall Street firm Bear Stearns, very famous Wall Street financial firm. And this man met Jeffrey Epstein and gave him a job on Wall Street. But Jeffrey Epstein flamed out of Wall Street over some, got himself into trouble with some of the deals that he was doing behind the scenes. And so he left Wall Street and then went off on his own and found a very receptive group of super wealthy individuals, excuse me, in terms of arms dealers. Jeffrey Epstein fancied himself as an international man of mystery and something of a spy. And he connected himself with very wealthy Middle Eastern arms dealers. And Jeffrey Epstein would work with them and put himself in the middle of making deals. And Jeffrey Epstein was taking a lot of money on the side. And we know of accusations of extortion. We know of accusations of theft of individuals' money. Leslie Wexner, in fact, said that Jeffrey Epstein had stolen millions of dollars from him. So Jeffrey Epstein was a grifter in a way, a financial grifter, and really was out about, to me, from my investigation, getting blackmail on people, engaging in extortion, but also surrounding himself with some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. And you have to wonder how he was able to pull all of that off and what his true connections were to intelligence. And we're learning now of even more of a deep connection that he had with the Russians. And you have to wonder, did he provide them with blackmail information on certain powerful individuals? Because we are learning now, and I think we'll learn more as Senator Wyden goes down this financial trail of uncovering the money that Jeffrey Epstein moved through Russian banks to pay off various individuals. And that money that I mentioned, the $1 billion, that was money in one single Jeffrey Epstein bank account. From what we've learned, Jeffrey Epstein had 158 individual bank accounts. So let's see what the estate turns over in terms of documentation, because we may be able to learn more about Jeffrey Epstein's financial trail from these men who the co-executives of the state, who at one point, the Attorney General Denise George in the Virgin Islands said they were his co-captains of his criminal enterprise.
So Dershowitz pops up all over the place in this. A sweetheart deal, allegations against him from Virginia. We've got a super chat question from JR. Can Barry explain the events surrounding the Dershowitz accusations and how did they go away?
Well, you're absolutely right. Virginia Giuffre, who was the most vocal and prominent of the Jeffrey Epstein accusers, was a woman who, at age 16, was working at Mar-a-Lago in the spa as a towel girl, providing towels to people who were there at the spa. A very minor job there. Her father, her dad, had been a maintenance worker at Mar-a-Lago and helped her get a job there. And both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell frequented Mar-a-Lago back in the day. And Ghislaine Maxwell happened to be seeing Virginia Giuffre reading a book on massage therapy and walked over to her and said, "Hey, I'm connected with a billionaire here in Palm Beach. He's always looking for traveling masseuses and private masseuses." And Ghislaine Maxwell just picked up Virginia Giuffre from Mar-a-Lago, and she ran and told her dad at Mar-a-Lago, "This is amazing. I met a woman who works for this billionaire, and they're going to give me a job," and so forth. Her own father drove her that night to Jeffrey Epstein's mansion, came to the door with his daughter. Ghislaine Maxwell shook hands with her father, Virginia's dad, and said, "She's in good hands. Don't worry about her. We're going to take care of her." And she was brought up to the massage room, and Jeffrey Epstein forced her to perform a sexual act on him during that massage and paid her money, and she felt trapped in a sense and was, for the next year or so, was put out by Jeffrey Epstein to some of his wealthy friends for sexual favors. And Dershowitz was initially on the list of men that she put together. And again, she was a 16-year-old girl who was in way over her head. And they in later years got involved in a defamation lawsuit, and Virginia had to subsequently come forward and say that she was mistaken about Dershowitz, that the gentleman's name that she thought was Alan Dershowitz may have been someone else. So he ended up, through his lawsuit against her, to clear his name, of getting her to redact the accusations that she had made against him. I mean, that's the story, and so he now feels that he has been vindicated in this sense. But I have to tell you that there's no perfect victim in this. When you're dealing with minors, you're dealing with people of who are 14 to 17 years old, who were being taken advantage of in this situation. You may get some facts wrong. It doesn't mean that what happened to them were false accusations. But she admitted that she made a mistake, and Dershowitz said fine and walked away from it. But we know that there were other men on her list, and we know that other victims have said that there were men that they were put out to. Some of them, they don't know their names. Some of them, they do know those names. And through this scandal that we're going through right now, I shouldn't say a scandal, I should use the words cover up, because I do think This is a cover-up of Watergate proportion that's taking place in the Trump administration. Why are they hiding the files from Americans? Why are they hiding the files from the victims? We know that Donald Trump is in the files. We know that the Wall Street Journal reported that his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, told Donald Trump that he is mentioned in the FBI files. We don't know in what context, but he is in there. And is the administration covering up for important individuals that he knows? Alan Dershowitz says for a fact that he knows the names of men. He claims that none of them are presently in the administration, but he says he knows the names of men. So we know from some of the lawyers, Bradley Edwards, who got involved in this case initially with some of the initial victims representing him, that these names of men are in confidential files. It is time to bring these names forward. But I have to tell you, with all that's going on, I am losing absolute trust here in our government to properly investigate this. They did send Ghislaine Maxwell to jail. They convicted her to serve 20 years behind bars as Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator. And they brought forward 4 women at trial who testified against her. Sadly, one of those women, Carolyn Adriano, who testified against Ghislaine Maxwell at trial, has passed on from the trauma that she's been going through. And there are other women. I learned in Washington earlier this week from some of the other victims, the names of some other victims who have lost their battles to drugs or alcohol because they remain traumatized from what happened to them as children. There are scars that run so deep among these women, these courageous women who are speaking now, coming forward. And it is so upsetting to the victims. They're being re-traumatized in this when you have a president who's calling this nothing more than a Democratic hoax and using the word that these files are bullshit or these files have been created by Obama or the Clintons. These are, and in fact, some of the women who stood at the press conference invited President Trump to meet them